Welcome to the Capital News. I am your host, Alex Karitis. Today is June 10th, 2019. Thank you so much for joining me. I know I have been away for a week longer than anticipated. I am continuing my travels. I know I was hoping to get to podcasting last Monday, but I ran into some internet difficulties and so was unable to provide any updates or any podcasts for last week. So I do apologize, but I thank you for being patient and being with me here. I'm continuing to travel here for probably the next couple of weeks, so I hope I am able to continue with the podcast moving forward. And it's such an interesting time, too, because we had quite a lot of news, a lot of swings in the markets, a lot of politics taking place. And so I'm going to do my best to sort of recap what we missed over the past week or so. And we'll just continue going along the way we do here at the Capital News, providing some updates as to what took place, and then just obviously providing my opinion and analysis of what's taking place and where we're likely headed. So I do want to focus a little bit on the tariff man, President Trump, and sort of the Mexican standoff that we witnessed last week, and obviously moved the markets and was causing some headaches for some, not just Democrats, but actually Republicans. There were a lot of Republicans who were sort of up in arms about the president taking to Twitter and making statements about potentially adding additional tariffs to Mexican goods coming into the United States as an attempt to get, I guess, the Mexicans to the negotiating table to handle the illegal immigration crisis, the drug crisis, a whole bunch of things, obviously dealing with the southern border. But before we get into the Mexican standoff, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the other politics, because we had the Trump family with the Queen of England obviously on that state visit. And I have to say that I think the president's speech, giving thanks and just sort of preserving the memory of the men who died and survived the Normandy invasion back in World War II. I have to give him a lot of credit. I thought that was a great speech. Thought, the president definitely has the ability to rise to the occasion. I just wish he did it more often, because given our discussions here on this podcast since we've been on the air, and most recently in regards to the letter that I had written to the president, we really need leadership in this country, and the president does have the ability to really showcase and exhibit great leadership traits. However, there's just too many times where he has to lower himself for whatever reason and get in the mud and fling dirt and dust and stones, and we really have to get away from that now. It might have been fancy, it might have been funny and comedic, and sometimes it actually still is, but we have to move beyond that, because we have real problems here in this country that need addressed, and they need addressed by leadership, because we're not going to get it from Nancy Pelosi, we're not going to get it from a lot of the Democrats, we're definitely not going to get it from a lot of the lunatics running on the 2020 ticket. Maybe somewhere down the trough on the Democrat ticket, but they're not likely to get any type of sunshine. So at this point, it's too early in the game to say that they're going to be a long shot and they're going to make it. So we're just going to wait and see what happens there. But Nancy Pelosi isn't going to bring anything new to the table. She's been a part of the problem. She's been a part of the swamp for 30 years. Mitch McConnell on the Republican side in the Senate, same deal. He's not bringing any new ideas. And in fact, his panacea for all of this was, well, let's just raise the tobacco age. Instead of it being 18, let's just say it's 21, and then all of our problems are going to go away. I mean, you can't take these people seriously. So they both need to resign. Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell, they both need to resign. It doesn't mean they need to leave Congress, although I wouldn't have a problem with that. But they need to resign their positions, because nothing's getting done. And there are too many issues facing this nation that need addressed, and they need real leadership. And again, the president is not helping matters in this case. And so, given his trip over there in Europe, Nancy Pelosi also made the trip. She wasn't a part of the state dinner, really, but she was over there paying her respects to the World War II vets over in France. And I have to give it to Nancy. I have to give credit where credit is due, because obviously they were getting little heated arguments back and forth between the president and Nancy Pelosi, because reportedly Nancy Pelosi told a room full of Democrats that instead of, the president being impeached, she'd rather see the president in prison. Well, you knew that was going to get out, and it did, and obviously the president did not like it and called her nasty. Now he's calling her Nervous Nancy and this, that, and the other, and it's just not stopping. And of course, he made a lot of these comments while overseas. Nancy Pelosi, however, said, based off of principle, however much you want to give that with that woman, but based off of principle, I do not make comments on foreign soil about the President of the United States. So at least there I have to give her credit for at least sort of toning it down, especially given the event and the reason why she was over there in Europe. But again, the President gets down in the mud, flings it right back at him. Again, I think that was fine for 2016. I think that was not necessarily needed, but it was something, it was fresh water in the face. It was something that the country we needed to be shaken up. And that's why I voted for the president, because the system needed to be shaken up, and I thought this was the guy who could do it. Now, he's definitely shaking things up, but really the results, just as far as my analysis is concerned, just isn't there. Yes, we have some deregulation. Yes, we have some tax cuts, but the tax cuts weren't paid for. They just simply weren't paid for. Now we have trillion-dollar deficits at the end of a business cycle, at the end of a credit cycle, and we're told that this is the greatest economy in U.S. history, yet somehow we still have trillion-dollar deficits. That doesn't make any sense. Those two things do not go together, with a whole host of other things that the president wants to claim on a nearly daily basis. But putting that aside, the politics of Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump, because now what do we expect to get done? Not much, because now if she truly said that, and she probably did, whether it was in jest or not, she's simply saying, I don't want him impeached, I want him in prison. And of course, that's, on the other side, that's outrageous. How dare somebody call for the president to be imprisoned? Of course, that wasn't any problem for people to say that Hillary Clinton should be in prison. Of course, I believe that Hillary Clinton should be in prison. If Donald Trump has committed a crime, he should be in prison as well. However, I just don't think there's enough there, at least not at this point, to send Donald Trump to prison. I'm not looking for that to happen. I don't want that to happen. I want this president to step up and show and exhibit leadership that this country needs to tackle the many, many issues that are facing this country. Our national debt that is continuing its ascent, nearing $23 trillion with no end in sight whatsoever. The president doesn't even talk about it. His administration barely ever talks about it. Social Security, Medicare going virtually insolvent within the next decade, call it. No discussion on that whatsoever. But we do have the tariff man. We do have this Mexican standoff. So the president was, of course, saying that the USMCA, which is NAFTA 2.0, if you will, is the greatest deal ever struck. Yet for some reason he wanted to perhaps throw it into a tizzy, into a tailspin by saying, well, you know what? Despite this great deal that we negotiated, obviously putting down NAFTA, which he calls one of the worst trade deals ever, he comes out and now he's like, well, you know what? We have to maybe, because we have such a problem on the southern border, we may have to threaten more tariffs on Mexican exports or imports into the United States. So this throws a huge tailspin. The markets don't like it, and the markets sold off. And we're going to get to that, and obviously there's going to be a lot of overlap here today and probably over the next couple of days as we progress on both the political, geopolitical podcast as well as the economic podcast, because this is really just all intertwined and all interconnected here. And I believe it's going to be for quite some time, especially over the summer. I am anticipating a pretty bumpy summer, simply because we have a lot of news coming down the pike. There's a lot of data that continues to come out. There's a lot of trade negotiations or non-negotiations that may or may not take place between the United States and China. Perhaps in this Mexican standoff, the Mexican legislature doesn't go through with this great new deal, and maybe we're right back at it, and the president's going to continue to threaten tariffs. But here's what happened last week. And it's sort of recurring again. This is the unpredictability of Trump. This also calls into question some of the credibility of Trump, which goes back to my letter to the president, because again, that is in my opinion, a characteristic or a quality of leadership. You have to have some credibility. So the president, I guess, in attempts to get the Mexicans back to the negotiating table, said, wait a minute, despite the USMCA, I'm going to slap an additional 5% tariff on all goods coming into the United States from Mexico, because we have a major crisis down at the border, which it just hasn't been alleviated. It's not been solved. And you guys, meaning the Mexicans, you have to do a better job at the U.S.-Mexican border and at your southern border, because there are too many illegal immigrants coming into this country. There are too many drugs coming into this country, human trafficking, sex trafficking. It's a disaster. We cannot have it. All of those things I agree with, by the way, obviously. I don't want illegal immigration. I don't want human trafficking. I don't want sex trafficking. I don't want drugs pouring into this country. But nevertheless, that is the reality. The president believes, I happen to believe he believes this strongly, that tariffs are a great tool. This is something that he can weaponize to bring people to the negotiating table to perhaps get what he is looking for. And obviously, in this case, he's looking for security. He's looking for a slowdown, if not a complete cease and desist of illegal immigration, of drugs. Good luck with that happening, but anything is better than nothing, right? So you have to sort of applaud the president in this manner from the standpoint of perhaps getting the Mexicans to take their border security a little bit more seriously. What we know is the markets obviously did not like this information. They sold off. We had a 5 or 6 week sell-off, which was completely almost undone last week in and of itself, which is another V-shaped recovery, which we're going to talk about in more detail on the economic podcast for today, and again, probably throughout this week, because we're going to continue to see what happens, because we're back, I think, in an era of bad news is good news, and again, we're going to talk about that more on the economic podcast, so be sure to check that out, because this is just such an interesting time that we live in right now. It's hard to understand. It's hard to describe what's going on because it's day to day, it's tweet to tweet, it's the president, it's a central banker. You don't know where the news is going to come out from, and it just shouldn't be that way. So the president was able to get the Mexicans back to the negotiating table. They're sitting there, okay, we just signed this deal. We don't want to, the USMCA, we don't want these tariffs, blah, 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 blah. Okay, we struck a deal. And of course, this was done at the 11th hour, because this had to be done last Friday. And it was done last Friday at the 11th hour before the tariffs would have gone into effect actually today. If an 11th hour deal was not struck, the tariffs, the 5% tariffs, would have been in effect today. And of course, it wasn't just 5%. It was going to be 5% per month until Donald Trump received some sort of satisfaction. What that satisfaction was, nobody knows. But those were basically his words. But it would continue to go up for 5 months. So basically, you would have a maximum of 25% tariffs on Mexican goods coming into the United States, which would have been, the markets just would have completely sold off if it ever got to 25%. They were having a hissy fit with the 5%. And we're going to get into a little bit of that too. But nevertheless, the Mexicans came to the table. They struck an 11th hour deal. Now, over the weekend, we have these reports from basically the New York Times, I believe it was, saying that, a lot of the things that were agreed to were already in negotiation. So this was basically Donald Trump being a showman and just sort of expediting the process, playing the strongman character, placating to his base, saying, look, we're going to put tariffs on these guys. We got a problem down there. The Democrats aren't helping us. I'm going to take matters into my own hand. I'm going to be the strong man. I'm going to be the strong leader for the United States. I'm going to act like the president. I'm going to act presidential. I'm going to threaten the Mexicans with 5% tariffs up to 25%, get them to the table, and they're going to agree with everything. Boom. 11th hour deal. No tariffs. At least they're suspended indefinitely. Now, of course, this isn't signed, sealed, delivered, because we have to await the Mexican legislature to approve this deal, because the Mexicans, or at least from what's being reported, are going to send about 6,000 troops down to their southern border to protect their border, to hopefully stop all immigration or illegal immigration coming into their country, which obviously is just simply going to trek north, because the destination is pretty much the United States of America. So there's a lot of follow-through that we have to see here. So I guess this is some sort of a trust but verify process, and that, again, is assuming that the Mexican legislature votes to approve whatever this deal is, because we don't know all of the details therein. But getting back to the New York Times story, we obviously have President Trump coming out and saying, well, this is fake news, this wasn't true, blah, blah, blah. But you have to also listen to some of the administration figures who were out there on the Sunday news circuit pretty much saying, using the word accelerated, that the Mexicans accelerated their efforts to assist the United States in border security. So the word accelerated means to me that something was already in place. You don't accelerate something that wasn't there. You would just say, well, here's what we're going to do, and then you do it. So the fact that this administration figure use the word accelerated says to me that there might be some actual truth to this New York Times story. Now, of course, we're going to go back and forth. The New York Times might defend themselves here and there. The president's going to obviously call them fake news. And this is very dangerous. This is a dangerous precedent because it's really calling into question, who do you trust? You're supposed to trust your president, at least in the perfect world. Of course, we don't live in a perfect world. So, I mean, that goes out the window right then and there because we've been lied to, president after president after president, government after government after government. So it's no surprise. That's what we do here at the Capitol News. We're looking for the truth the best we can find it because it's not easy, and that's a shame because we should have nothing but information these days, the internet at our fingertips, the world at our fingertips, but actually finding the truth is quite difficult because you want to believe these institutions. You want to believe the White House. You want to believe the President of the United States. And you also want to believe the New York Times. Regardless of what your political slant might be, you want to believe media outlets because that's their job, to research, to investigate, and then to tell the truth, to report the facts. So the fact that we always have this, we've had this war between the media and the president for the past 3 years now, with no end in sight. This is not good for public discourse. This, again, to me, is sort of a lack of leadership at this point from the president that starts to call into his, calls into question his credibility, because we can't have this. Because now it's like, who do you believe? And is it about facts or is it just opinion? And is it just about politics? Am I a Democrat, so I'm just going to agree with everything the Democrats say? I'm a Republican, so I'm just going to agree with everything the president says and what the Republicans say. We have to do better than this. We must do better than this because this divide and conquer tactics is why we have $23 trillion in debt. This is why we adopt terrible economic policies that are just flawed from the beginning. We cannot have this anymore. And I am calling on the president to put this aside the best that he can. Get out of the mud, get out of the dirt, and lead. I know it's not easy. I know it's easier for me behind a microphone doing a podcast to say that. I know he's been under investigation for 22 months that sort of handcuffed his administration. I know he has Democrats who are rarely willing to work with him. It's incredibly difficult now because the Democrats have control of the House. So I understand that this man is up against a lot. I've always defended this president when it came to those investigations. I continue to defend him when it comes to those investigations. And I will continue to do so if that remains in the news. However, I think we are really at a crossroads here where we just have to really have strong leadership here at home that can get Democrats and Republicans in a room to solve a lot of these problems. Because despite the fact that the USMCA was negotiated, it's still not passed here in the United States. We've had this discussion, I believe it was a week and a half ago, because we don't know if it's going to pass. We don't know if Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats will even put it to a vote, because the White House came out and was saying, well, we're hoping this can be done, before they go on recess, which is only a couple of months away. There's no way in hell that that's going to happen. But we'll keep you posted to see what does happen. But infrastructure is pretty much on the chopping block now. That's unlikely to be done. So what is going to be done domestically? Not much, if anything, which is a true shame, which is why I called for the resignation of Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell, because they are not leading. They are not doing anything. We need to have things done. So I do want to continue with some of this Mexican standoff because I saw an interesting interview, maybe it was last week, with Peter Navarro. And Peter Navarro is one of Donald Trump's key trade delegates in I don't even know what word to use for this guy sometimes. He's definitely, I think, the quote-unquote strong man and a huge advocate for tariffs. And given his rhetoric, Peter Navarro's rhetoric, on the interview I saw on CNBC, and that from the president, I think it's pretty safe to say that Peter Navarro won the argument. Any type of debate or argument that was had in the White House, Peter Navarro came out on top. And the president talks like Peter Navarro. So Peter Navarro has the president's ear, at least for the time being. And Peter Navarro was out there and he was talking about trade and he was talking about tariffs. And the CNBC interviewers were straightforward with him, and they said, Mr. Navarro, can you explain how these tariffs are working? Because isn't it American consumers and American businesses who are paying the tax? Which, of course, we know is the case. But this is the guy who has Donald Trump's ear and says, no, that's not the case, which is a bunch of malarkey. But nevertheless, this is what comes out of this White House, unfortunately. And his argument was, well, look, you have to look at this as a dynamic situation, which is true. You have to look at it as a dynamic situation. And he's saying, look, if we increase these tariffs or put tariffs on these countries, here's what's going to happen. They're going to actually lower their costs so that the net effect is no different for the American business and for the American consumer. This isn't true, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that it was. Because Mr. Navarro made an additional statement saying, look, he's saying that supply chains are leaving. This is going to threaten, the Chinese. This will threaten the Mexicans. And that's why they're going to lower their prices. You can't have it both ways. If they're lowering their prices so that the virtual net effect from the American business or the American consumer who is buying these Mexican imports, or exports, I should say, if the price is the same, then why do they have to worry about supply chain issues? Why do they have to worry about countries leaving Mexico? They wouldn't. Why would they? So you can't have it both ways. I hope that makes sense. In one way, Navarro's saying, look, they're just going to lower their prices because they want to maintain market share. They don't want to lose the business elsewhere, which is a true statement from the standpoint of they probably do not want to lose business. But it's not the Mexican government or Mexican businesses that are paying the tax. They're not writing a check to the U.S. Treasury. This is the argument that the Trump administration is making. This is the argument that Peter Navarro is making. This is the argument that Donald Trump is making. Likewise, Peter Navarro wants to have his cake and eat it too, and he wants to say, well, look, these countries are afraid that supply chains are going to get disrupted, that people are going to look elsewhere. Well, if they're lowering their prices so that the net effect is virtually zero, then why would anybody look elsewhere? They wouldn't. Because you look at it from this standpoint, you're either going to pay the Mexicans $100 for the goods and they come in, or, according to Peter Navarro, they're going to lower their costs to, say, $95, and then you're going to pay the Mexicans $95, and then you're going to send $5 to Uncle Sam. American business doesn't care who's getting the money. Where it goes, $100 is $100. He's no better off, he's no worse off. It's the same situation. That's Navarro's argument. Doesn't make sense. Does not make complete sense. And this is the world we live in. Sad reality. Because he has the president's ear. The president tends to believe this. These are not the facts. Because you have to look at some of the data. And you have to look at the Chinese trade surplus against the U.S. It's the largest in history. So much for winning this trade war, which is continuing. And we're going to talk about that today in the Economic Podcast, so be sure to check that out, because that's the other thing. We have the president who is perhaps going to meet with President Xi of China within a couple of weeks at the G20 meeting in Japan. And we have the president threatening tariffs again on China. He's also now threatening tariffs again on the Mexicans if they do not fulfill the deal, which I guess makes sense. In all honesty, it does. So it's sort of the trust but verify. That's the carrot and the stick. If you don't fulfill your side of the bargain, well, we're going to have to slap these tariffs on. But this throws another wrench into the negotiations with China, because even if you strike a deal, as the U.S. did with Mexico in the USMCA, Trump still may not be satisfied, because there might be some other issue somewhere lurking in a corner somewhere that Trump's going to say, oh, wait. I want you back to the table, and if you don't come back to the table, I'm going to hit you with more tariffs. Because he thinks tariffs are the best thing ever, like Peter Navarro. There's no negative side effect to the American economy, that the American consumer pays nothing, that the American business pays nothing, that there's no increase in any costs, and that the U.S. Treasury just rakes in billions and billions of dollars. If that was the case, then why would the president want to negotiate any sort of free trade agreement? If the tariffs are so fantastic for this country, then why would he want to negotiate any sort of free trade agreement? Why would he want to do any type of deal with China? Why would he want to do any type of deal with the Canadians or the Mexicans? It just doesn't make any sense. Talking out of both sides of his mouth. That's what this administration does. This is not unique to the president, so don't think that I am picking on this president in particular. This is what they do. This, again, goes to the question of credibility. This is why we have so many flawed policies, because nobody knows who to believe. Because it's one day it's this, next day it's that. So your guess is as good as mine as to what's going to happen with Mexico. Your guess is as good as mine as to what's going to take place with the United States and China, because you have the president back at it, sort of thumping his chest, playing the strong man, saying that China needs to make a deal, or they're in the process of being decimated economically because of these tariffs. So they are going to make a deal. That's Trump talking. Now we're going to have a further discussion on that in the economic podcast, so be sure to join us there. And I'm sure it's going to come up on the political, geopolitical podcast too later in this week, because this is a very fluid and dynamic situation. We don't know what's going to come out. I mean, again, I do these late in the evening. I mean, in a few hours, 3, 4 in the morning, Donald Trump could tweet something that moves the markets in the morning. This is beyond the pale. This is what I'm talking about. This is why that letter was written. We cannot have this, because it's most definitely market manipulation. So check out the economic podcast, because we're going to continue this conversation, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty a little bit. So thank you so much for joining me. Glad to be back with you guys. I actually miss doing these podcasts, despite the fact that we talk about so much negative stuff all the time. But you got to talk about the negative stuff so you can turn it around and make it positive. Because I think the future, if we grab hold of these problems, will be quite possibly the best this country has ever seen. But we have to tackle these problems first, and we have to identify them and declare that we have a problem. Because if we don't recognize and admit that we have a problem, we're never going to solve it. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to have you guys back tomorrow. So stay tuned. This is the Capital News. I am Alex Kreitis. Godspeed.